So the body's anatomy originates at the cellular level, and how the body works is physiology. All cellular reactions that work together to sustain life is metabolism. Metabolism is broken down into two categories. Catabolism is when complex substances are broken down into simpler molecules. An example of this would be the food you eat getting digested and turned into energy for the body to use. The other type of metabolism is anabolism, which is when simple compounds are built into substances needed for cellular activities, such as bone growth and muscle repair. As you can see, between catabolism and anabolism, everything the body needs to thrive is taken care of. The body systems demand metabolism in order to function, but beyond that, they work simultaneously as a team to maintain a state of balance in the body, which is called homeostasis. The main mechanism of homeostasis is negative feedback. Negative feedback is the state of the body in which the body sends signals to itself to keep conditions within set limits. Occasionally, the body must produce a stimulus, and when that is the case, that is called positive feedback. Here's what I mean. Your normal body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius or 98 degrees Fahrenheit. Because we live in the Midwest and experience cold winters and hot summers, I'm confident your internal body temperature has tried to waver from this set temperature limit once or twice. So when you get cold or hot, a center in your brain detects those changes and sends impulses to the appropriate mechanisms to initiate heating or cooling. If you're cold, you start shivering, and if you're hot, you start sweating. After this, your different body systems adjust the body's temperature, and eventually your body will return to its set point of 98.6 degrees. That is negative feedback, a state of the body in which it does whatever it can to keep the body within its normal limits. On the other hand, there are times when your body must create a stimulus because what it is experiencing cannot be maintained or made right. And a great example of this is childbirth. When the body is ready to deliver a baby, it must go through a series of positive feedback steps in order for this to happen. Usually, it begins with the onset of contractions. As a result of these contractions, the cervix begins to efface and dilate. Once the cervix is completely dilated and effaced, it is prepared for the baby to travel through the birth canal, and the baby is delivered, usually followed by the placenta, after which the new mother immediately should begin the recovery process of the dramatic event whereby the contractions begin to slow and eventually all the contents of the uterus are shed. Because labor is not a normal life event like temperature regulation, the body is not activating its negative feedback mechanisms to try to make the body normal again. Instead, it goes into positive feedback mode to get the baby out, and then and only then can labor stop. I'd like you to take notice of the fact that there is no arrow leading from recovery back to labor again. This is because once the baby is delivered, then negative feedback begins as the body attempts to slow the bleeding that follows childbirth, and it begins to form blood clots, which eventually lessen, and the mother recovers. Does that make sense? You can find more examples of negative and positive feedback online if you Google the different types specifically. Okay, now we're going to transition into anatomical position, directional terms, and specific anatomy review. First up, what is anatomical position? It is always, always, always the method in which we determine the patient's left side from their right side. Anatomical position is determined based on a person standing, facing forward, with their palms facing forward, like this. This is our reference point, which ultimately helps healthcare personnel navigate the patient and helps us specifically prevent wrong site surgeries. Speaking of navigating the body, this slide is going to tell you about your key navigational terms. Just like if you were using a navigation system on your phone or in your car, it would say things like north or south or east or west. Well, like I told you earlier, in healthcare, we use a different language. So the first word you must master is superior. Superior is the word we will use whenever we want to talk about a structure that is on top of something else or above something. For example, the heart is superior to the diaphragm. Next is inferior, which is the exact opposite. We use inferior when we want to describe something that is below something else, like the diaphragm is inferior to the heart. It gets interesting, though, when we use the same structure as our point of reference in relation to other structures, like the diaphragm is inferior to the heart, but superior to the stomach. In this single sentence, we've mapped out 3 major anatomical structures in their generally correct location. Of course, we can get even more specific. So we have words like ventral and dorsal. Ventral is the term we use whenever we want to describe something that is on the front side of the body. As you can see here, ventral is sometimes interchanged with anterior. This is important if we're talking about something being in front of something else. We use the term ventral when we're talking about anything in the front half of the body, like a ventral hernia. All that matters is that it's in the front. It won't be anywhere but in the front half of the body. But we use the word anterior whenever we need to use that structure as a point of reference to something that's behind it. Like the vagina is anterior to the rectum. Both the vagina and the rectum are in the ventral cavity of a female, but if there is an anatomical malformation present, we have to be able to differentiate between the two. In the same basic manner, just the opposite direction, is dorsal and posterior. The term dorsal is used to describe anything in the back half of the body, like the spine in the dorsal cavity. I always remembered dorsal in school because I thought of the dorsal fin on a shark and how it was on his back. We use posterior in the same relative way that we use anterior, but we're trying to describe something that is behind something else, like the sigmoid colon is posterior to the uterus in females. Got it? Rewind and repeat if needed. I'll be here waiting for you. Cranial and caudal are terms used to describe anything pertaining to toward the head or toward the tail. In my experience, these terms were used mostly when directing equipment in relation to the patient, such as radiology, when the physician asked for a more caudal view where he was directing the radiology tech to angle their image more towards the tail. Next up are medial and lateral. Medial is anything towards the middle of the patient, and lateral is anything out to the side. Again, these terms are relative because you can use the same structure as a point of reference and correctly use both terms. For example, the right nipple is medial to the right arm, but the right nipple is lateral to the sternum. Last up is proximal and distal. Proximal is used to describe something's point of origin. Distal is the exact opposite, describing something far from a point of origin. The point of origin is the key factor when using proximal and distal, and you'll hear it a lot in orthopedics when talking about bones, and sometimes in general surgery when talking about the intestine. Here's an example. Think about your femur. Its point of origin is near the pelvis because everything developed from the middle and continued outward. So, the proximal femur is by the hip, while the distal femur is by the knee. In class, we'll have some exercises to run through to make sure you understand these concepts.